Welcome to the Daily Story Brief. We're opening today with a story that is just a profound tragedy in the nation's capital.
It's a tragedy that has moved with just stunning speed.
Stunning speed, yeah. From what seemed at first like a local crime investigation to a global inflection point.
It really is. It sparked these immediate and frankly sweeping national policy changes that could redefine immigration in America for decades to come.
So our mission today is to really get into the facts. We need to understand the shooting itself, the surprising and very complex background of the man accused.
And then we have to analyze the resulting government crackdown. It's a set of actions that targets not just the suspect, but entire global communities.
Okay, so let's start at the beginning. We have to begin with the grim details of the ambush itself.
Right.
This happened right in the heart of Washington, D.C. It was around 2:15 in the afternoon on Wednesday, November 26, 2025, right near the Farragut Square metro station.
A very busy area. And the victims were two members of the National Guard. They were serving on what was already a very controversial deployment in the city.
We'll get to that controversy in a minute, but let's focus on the victims first.
Of course. Specialist Sarah Beckstrom, who is just 20 years old, and Staff Sergeant Andrew Wolfe, who is 24, both from the West Virginia National Guard.
And this was the day before Thanksgiving. The city was already kind of slowing down for the holiday.
Exactly. And the outcome was just heartbreaking. Specialist Beckstrom, she'd only entered service in June of 2023. She was so new to it.
So young.
And she died from her injuries the next day, on Thanksgiving Day. Her father confirmed the news online. It's just devastating.
And Staff Sergeant Wolfe.
He's a longer-serving member, started back in February 2019. He remains in the hospital in critical condition.
So U.S. Attorney Jeanine Pirro, she characterized this as an ambush-style attack.
Yes. The suspect was a lone gunman, and he was armed with a .357 Smith & Wesson revolver.
So this wasn't random. This was planned.
It indicates a deliberate, lethal intent.
Absolutely. Fortunately, there was another National Guard member nearby who was able to respond almost immediately.
And he took the suspect down?
He shot the suspect 4 times. The suspect is currently hospitalized in serious condition. But, the legal process, that began moving instantly.
And the moment Specialist Beckstrom passed away, the legal stakes just shot up.
Absolutely. The initial charges were assault with intent to kill. The second she died, those were instantly upgraded to first-degree murder.
And Pirro made it very clear where the Justice Department stood on this.
Oh, absolutely. She spoke alongside Attorney General Pam Bondi, and she framed it as a premeditated assassination attempt on members of the armed services.
Her quote was that the suspect ambushed people who didn't know what was coming.
Exactly. And they've already publicly stated that they will seek the death penalty if Staff Sergeant Wolfe doesn't survive his injuries.
On top of all that, the FBI is treating the whole incident as an act of domestic terrorism, which is a very significant designation. It opens up a whole different level of investigation and potential charges.
It's crucial, I think, for you to understand the political atmosphere these soldiers were operating in, because this wasn't some standard deployment.
No, not at all. They were part of what's called the D.C. Task Force. This was a contingent of nearly 2,200 National Guard troops.
And they were deployed back in August 2025 by the president himself.
Right, after he declared a crime emergency in D.C.
And that deployment was, to put it mildly, a political powder keg, even before this shooting happened.
It absolutely was. The D.C. Attorney General had already challenged the legality of it in federal court.
What was the basis of that challenge?
The argument centered on the idea that the president was using the National Guard for routine law enforcement roles, things that, fall outside their traditional scope.
And that this violated the city's right to self-government.
Precisely. It was a major constitutional showdown.
So what was the status of that legal challenge right before the ambush happened? Where did it stand?
It was literally hanging in the balance. Just a few days before the shooting, a federal district judge had delivered a pretty significant blow to the administration.
The judge ruled against the deployment.
The ruling said the deployment was likely illegal, that it represented an overreach of executive authority.
Wow. So a federal judge essentially declared the mission invalid.
But here's the key part. The enforcement of that ruling, the order to actually pull the troops out, was temporarily paused.
Why?
It was paused until December 11th to give the administration time to file an appeal. So these Guard members, like Specialist Beckstrom and Staff Sergeant Wolfe, they were operating in D.C. under this huge cloud of legal contention.
So you have a deployment, that a federal judge believes is unconstitutional, and then that very deployment is specifically targeted in a violent attack.
Yes. It's an almost unbelievable confluence of events.
So what was the administration's immediate response to that, to this direct escalation?
Well, despite the legal battle, despite the tragic proof that these troops were now targets, the president chose to double down.
Double down how?
He immediately ordered an additional 500 National Guard members to D.C.
So he increased the deployment.
Increased it, raising the total to nearly 2,700 troops. It was a move that explicitly signaled his defiance of the legal challenge. He was escalating the very mission a judge had just called illegal.
Okay, so that's the context. Now we have to unpack who the shooter is, because this is where the incident really shifts from a tragedy into this incredibly complicated national security and policy crisis.
Right.
The suspect's name is Ramanullah Lakanwal. He's 29 years old, an Afghan national.
And here's the first strange detail. He didn't live locally. He drove across the entire country from his home in Washington state, specifically to carry out this attack in the capital.
Across the entire country.
Yes. And his identity, and even more critically, the way he entered the U.S., that became the immediate focus of all the political fallout.
He came here through a very specific program created after the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan. It was called Operation Allies Welcome.
Exactly. He entered in September of 2021 under OEW. This program was, it was essentially a humanitarian effort. It was designed to rapidly relocate Afghan nationals who had worked with and often risked their lives for U.S. forces.
And OEW brought in a massive number of people.
Roughly 76,000 Afghans came to the U.S. through that program, and the current administration has been criticizing it basically since day one, claiming it had lax vetting standards.
Although, and we should be clear about this, proponents of OEW always push back on that.
Yeah.
They stress that these Afghan allies were subjected to extensive security screening.
Oh, absolutely. Multiple intelligence agencies, law enforcement bodies like the FBI, DHS, they were all involved in that screening process.
There was a balance, right, between urgency and security.
That was the idea. But here's the key fact that immediately blew up the political narrative.
Go on.
Initially, you had sources in the administration claiming that Lakanwal had overstayed a visa or that he was in the country illegally.
Right, that was the initial report.
Right. But then, consistent reporting confirmed something else entirely. While he had applied for asylum during the previous administration, his asylum status was officially granted by the Trump administration in April of 2025.
Let's just pause on that for a second. That's politically explosive.
It is.
The shooting is being used as Exhibit A, that the previous administration's vetting failed. But the shooter's actual legal status, his asylum, was formally approved by the current administration just 7 months ago.
The irony is just profound. It completely undercuts the immediate narrative that this was all a consequence of the chaotic withdrawal in 2021.
It forces the administration to confront the idea that their own vetting processes, conducted very recently, cleared this man for permanent residence.
It pivots the narrative. It shifts the focus from a potential failure in 2021 to a potential failure in 2025. Or maybe it suggests the problem is just far more complex than a simple lax vetting slogan can capture.
And the complexity, it just keeps deepening when you look at why he was eligible for this program in the first place.
Right.
He wasn't just some translator. He had specific high-level ties to U.S. counterterrorism operations, specifically with the CIA.
And this was confirmed publicly by the CIA director, John Ratcliffe. He stated that Lakanwal's admission was explicitly, and this is a quote, due to his prior work with the U.S. government, including CIA.
And he served in a very specialized, highly kinetic Afghan army unit. They were known as the Zero units.
Or the Scorpion Forces. They had a few names.
We really need to spend some time on these Zero units, because for you, the listener, to really understand Lakanwal's profile and the significance of his whole trajectory, you need to know what kind of entity this was. These weren't regular army forces, were they?
No, not at all. The Zero units were paramilitary groups. They were highly secretive, and they operated under the direction and, crucially, the financing of the CIA.
So they were strike forces.
That's what they were often called. They were tasked with these very aggressive counterterrorism and counterinsurgency operations, primarily targeting the Taliban, but operating way outside the traditional military chain of command.
So they were essentially a covert extension of U.S. intelligence on the ground in Afghanistan.
That is exactly the operational model. And Lakanwal was specifically recruited to Unit 03 of the Kandahar Strike Force.
And he had been with them for a long time.
A very long time. He started way back in 2012 just as a security guard. So that shows this long-term loyalty, this deep integration with the U.S. effort.
And he was promoted over time.
Yes, eventually becoming a team leader and a GPS specialist. And just for context on his final service, reports indicate he was helping guard U.S. forces at the chaotic Kabul airport perimeter during that 2021 evacuation.
So he was a trusted insider, a frontline operative.
Absolutely, but the shadow that surrounds these units is immense. When we talk about them, we have to acknowledge the severe allegations that were leveled against them by international human rights watchdogs for years.
And this is really the darkest, most complicated part of this entire story.
It is. For years, organizations like Human Rights Watch, they consistently scrutinized the Zero units. They often just outright labeled them death squads.
And the allegations aren't minor. We're talking about systematic abuses.
Yes, abuses that violate international humanitarian law. We're talking about serious crimes like extrajudicial executions.
Meaning killings carried out without any legal process.
Exactly. They're also accused of enforced disappearances, basically making people vanish without a trace, which creates this terror in local populations.
And indiscriminate attacks.
Yes, including airstrikes that hit civilian targets and even medical facilities. There was a huge Human Rights Watch report back in 2019 that specifically documented these patterns of abuse.
And the report noted that because these units were backed by the CIA and operated outside conventional military oversight, they often acted with impunity.
There was no accountability. So this is the man, Ramanullah Lakanwal. He was a highly valued long-term ally, but he was operating inside a U.S.-backed structure that critics viewed as inherently brutal and accountable to no one.
This is not the profile of a simple refugee fleeing a war. It's the profile of a high-risk, high-trauma asset.
It really is, and it creates this deep moral and ethical conundrum for the U.S. government.
How
So you rely on these forces to do the dirty work in a chaotic war zone. You promise them safety and refuge in return for their service.
That's the very nature of that job.
The nature of that job exposes them to profound trauma. It forces them into actions that can shatter them psychologically. So when Lakanwal arrives in the U.S., he doesn't just bring his loyalty. He brings years of exposure to state-sanctioned violence and all the mental baggage from the front line.
Which brings us to the question of motive. U.S. Attorney Piero, she declined to discuss it. But investigators have to be looking at what tipped him. What turned him from a U.S.-granted asylum seeker into a terrorist attacker.
And sources confirm they are intensely focused on his psychological state. Even the president, in his characteristically blunt way, weighed in on it.
What did he say?
He suggested Lakanwal went cuckoo and went nuts after the war.
Crude, but it points to a recognition that trauma might be a factor.
It does. And a U.S. official provided some more concrete insight. They confirmed Lakanwal had been deeply disturbed by the exceptionally high number of casualties his Zero units suffered overseas.
These units were in constant high-intensity combat.
Constantly. The loss rates were just staggering, and that kind of loss takes a toll.
Was there a more recent trigger? Something that might have pushed him over the edge?
It seems so. The sources indicate that Lakanwal was recently and very deeply troubled by the killing of a close friend overseas.
So it's the cascading series of traumatic events.
That's what it looks like. Years of intense combat trauma, maybe compounded by guilt or regret over his unit's alleged actions, and then a recent, very personal loss that may have pushed him past a breaking point.
So what emerges is this profile of an Afghan ally who helped guard U.S. forces, who was granted asylum by the current government, but who seems to have been suffering from this profound, undiagnosed or untreated psychological distress that finally culminated in this horrific act of violence.
It is a profoundly difficult and layered context.
And yet, the second his identity was confirmed, the political machine just immediately seized on the simplest possible narrative.
Yeah.
Immigration failure.
The reaction from the administration was instant and maximalist. The president used the shooting to validate his entire hardline stance on immigration.
He called it a heinous assault.
A heinous assault that, in his words, proves that lax migration policies are the single greatest national security threat facing our nation.
And he wasn't subtle about assigning blame either. He repeatedly cited these huge figures about previous administration.
Not at all. He repeatedly faulted the Biden administration for letting in what he claimed were 20 million unknown and unvetted foreigners. He created this impression that Lakanwal was some unvetted illegal entrant, despite all the confirmed facts we just discussed.
Despite his CIA ties, despite his 2025 asylum grant.
Exactly.
Beyond the policy rhetoric, his personal response to the tragedy of Special Beckstrom's death, that drew some really sharp criticism.
It was startlingly abrupt. When a reporter asked if he planned to attend her funeral, his response was, Well, it was highly politicized.
What happened?
He gave a kind of non-committal answer at first, but then he immediately pivoted to bragging about his electoral success in her home state. He said, I love West Virginia. You know, I won West Virginia by one of the biggest margins of any president anywhere.
While being asked about the funeral of a soldier from that state.
Yes. And commentators immediately seized on this as a moment of just extreme disconnect.
The response suggested a total inability to center on her sacrifice.
It turned her death into an opportunity for self-aggrandizement. Political commentators like Tom Nichols called it a demented, malignant narcissist moment, arguing that even in the face of this national tragedy, the focus couldn't be removed from the president's own popularity.
It highlighted this perceived lack of empathy that, it almost dominated the news cycle as much as the shooting itself.
It did. And then there was the confrontation with CBS News reporter Nancy Cordes, which just further cemented the administration's defensiveness over this whole vetting issue.
Right. What happened there?
Well, Cordes challenged the president's claims. She specifically cited a Department of Justice Inspector General report that had found that the Afghan arrivals, including those under OEW, did receive thorough vetting by Homeland Security and the FBI.
So she was using the government's own findings to question his narrative.
And his reaction was incredibly aggressive. He publicly lashed out at her, demanding, "Are you stupid? Are you a stupid person?" It was a really clear example of the administration just refusing to let facts, even their own confirmed government reports, interfere with the political utility of the crisis.
And if we move from the president's remarks to his advisor, Stephen Miller, the rhetoric intensified even more. It moved beyond a specific policy critique into these broader, more aggressive claims about assimilation itself.
Miller's comments were chillingly explicit. He was responding to this wave of criticism that was urging against collective punishment for the Afghan community.
And he just dismissed the whole idea of successful large-scale migration.
He did. He wrote that mass migration is the great lie. He argued, and I'm quoting here, "You are not just importing individuals, you are importing societies. No magic transformation occurs when failed states cross borders. At scale, migrants and their descendants recreate the conditions and terrors of their broken homelands."
He called assimilation fundamentally impossible.
He did, and that is an overtly xenophobic and historically loaded argument.
So how did historians and policy professors respond to that specific line of attack?
With immediate and forceful condemnation, mostly by connecting it to historical precedent. Scholars pointed out that Miller's comments were almost word for word identical to the rhetoric used by xenophobes in the U.S. back in the 1930s and 40s.
Hey, it's cool.
Against immigrants fleeing persecution in Eastern Europe. Specifically, they pointed out this was the rhetoric used against Miller's own Jewish ancestors.
So the historical parallel is that this idea that migrants bring the terrors of their broken homelands, this is just a recurring anti-immigrant trope. It's been used against virtually every non-Western group that has sought refuge here.
Exactly. Don Moynihan, a policy professor at the University of Michigan, he noted that this rhetoric is deeply at odds with the vision and history of America, which is fundamentally built on assimilation and change. The analysis was clear. This wasn't a new policy critique. This was an attempt to justify a new, deep skepticism of multiculturalism, using the D.C. tragedy as cover.
So amidst this firestorm of political rhetoric, how did the Afghan community in the U.S. react? They're caught in the middle of all of this.
They moved very quickly to try and manage the crisis. Afghan organizations swiftly condemned the attack as deeply tragic. They emphasized very strongly that Lakanwal does not represent the broader law-abiding Afghan community.
A community that risked everything to support the U.S.
Exactly. The Afghan Community Coalition of the United States called for a full investigation, but made this desperate plea to the government not to suspend all immigration claims.
They were essentially saying, don't forget the 20 years of partnership.
Precisely. They said 20 years of Afghan-U.S. partnership must not be forgotten. Advocacy groups like Afghanivac, they were very vocal in warning against using the attack for collective punishment.
And let's spend a moment on that term, collective punishment. For listeners who might not be familiar with the specific legal meaning, why is the Afghan community using that exact phrase?
It's a term that's often used in international law, and its core meaning is assigning guilt or a penalty to an entire group for the actions of a single individual or a small group.
So they're saying the policy response punishes everyone for the actions of one person.
Exactly. When they use it here, they're pointing out that suspending immigration for all Afghans or reviewing the green cards of people from 19 different nations It punishes hundreds of thousands of innocent legal residents and applicants based entirely on the actions of Ramanullah Lakanwal. It violates the basic principle that guilt has to be personal.
And despite those pleas, the policy shift was, well, it was already underway.
It was immediate.
Let's detail the scope of this immigration crackdown that followed the shooting.
The very first action was laser-focused on Afghanistan. USCIS, that's U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, immediately suspended the processing of all immigration requests for Afghan nationals.
So special immigrant visas, asylum, all of it just stopped.
Everything came to a halt pending a review of security and vetting protocols. Now, this wasn't entirely new. Afghanistan was already one of 12 countries included in a narrower travel ban implemented earlier in the year.
But the real scale of the policy change was revealed on Thanksgiving Day. The president escalated the plan far beyond just Afghanistan.
That Thanksgiving social media post, it basically became a manifesto for a massive reversal of U.S. migration policy. The president announced plans to permanently pause migration from all third world countries to allow the U.S. system to fully recover.
And the terminology there, third world countries, that is deeply loaded, isn't it?
Absolutely. It's a term that's rooted in the Cold War era. It's widely considered archaic, insensitive, derogatory.
It lumps together most of Africa, Asia, and Latin America.
It does, and its use by the head of state signaled this deliberate and provocative rejection of modern diplomatic language. It positioned all of these nations as inherently problematic sources of migration.
And the ban was also coupled with pledges to retroactively reverse previous decisions.
Yes, he pledged to terminate all of the millions of Biden illegal admissions, and, crucially, to remove anyone who is not a net asset to the United States or is incapable of loving our country.
And then there was that last point about cultural compatibility.
Right. He added this explicit ideological commitment, deporting foreign nationals who are non-compatible with Western civilization.
That's a shift from security or economic rationales to one based on, cultural and ideological purity.
It's an unprecedented level of ideological screening in modern U.S. immigration policy, and the administration immediately moved to implement it through this green card review of people from 19 countries.
This might be the most shocking part of the whole response, targeting legal permanent residents, people who hold green cards.
It's a huge shift. The USCIS director, Joseph Edlow, he announced a full-scale, rigorous reexamination of every green card for every alien from every country of concern.
So people who went through the extensive process years ago, who built lives here, now face having their status reviewed and maybe revoked.
Exactly, based on a generalized national security concern tied to their country of origin.
Can you walk us through the full list of countries involved in this review?
It is an extensive list. It covers 3 continents, spans nations dealing with conflict, political instability, or previous sanctions, 19 nations in total.
And they're broken into 2 categories.
Yes, 12 countries are designated as fully restricted. For them, all immigration processing is suspended, and all existing green cards are under full review.
And those are?
Afghanistan, Burma, Chad, the Republic of the Congo, Equatorial Guinea, Eritrea, Haiti, Iran, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and Yemen.
That group seems to largely align with countries that have been previously identified as states of concern for various reasons. What about the partially restricted list?
That list has 7 countries, and it's also significant because it shows the global sweep of this. The 7 are Burundi, Cuba, Laos, Sierra Leone, Togo, Turkmenistan, and Venezuela.
And for them, some visas might still be processed, but all green card holders are subject to this reexamination.
Which creates just immense instability for people who have built lives, homes, businesses here under the assumption of permanent legal residency.
And the administration also leveraged its financial tools to restrict movement, right?
Yep.
The scrutiny of cross-border money transfers.
That's right. The Treasury Department's Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, or FinCEN, issued a formal alert. It urged all financial institutions, especially money services businesses, the places people use to send money home, to heighten their scrutiny.
On what grounds?
The justification was that individuals without legal status pose significant threats to national security, and it framed remittances as potential funding streams for smuggling and trafficking.
So this action serves 2 purposes. It adds a layer of surveillance, and it makes life much harder for undocumented immigrants trying to support their families back home.
It creates a choke point. You raise transaction costs, you create a fear of surveillance, and you disrupt one of the most vital connections these communities have with their home countries. It basically weaponizes the financial system against them.
So what was the international response to all of this? The U.S. using an isolated incident to justify such sweeping mass restrictions.
The response was one of dismay and appeals to international law. UN agencies like the High Commissioner for Refugees publicly appealed to Washington to honor its international commitments.
Specifically citing the 1953 Refugee Convention.
Yes, which guarantees due process for asylum seekers and mandates non-refoulement, the rule against sending refugees back into danger.
And the UN Human Rights Office, they specifically addressed the justification the administration was using.
They did. They forcefully stressed that using an isolated incident to justify mass restrictions is, and I quote, inconsistent with evidence showing no link between refugee arrivals and increased crime.
In other words, the data doesn't support the policy.
They're saying the policy is politically driven, not evidence-based. And domestically, groups like CARE, the Council on American Islamic Relations, they just reiterated their condemnation of the moves as a form of collective punishment.
Okay, let's pivot now to what this means on the ground. For enforcement and for the lives of the people being targeted. Lakanwal is still hospitalized, facing murder charges, but the administration is now looking at his family.
Lakanwal is facing the most severe charges possible. Authorities have said there will be many more charges to come, likely including terrorism statutes. But the administration has made it very clear that the consequences will extend to his immediate family.
What did the president say about them?
He was asked about Lakanwal's wife and his 5 children in Washington state. He was very direct. He said, we're looking at that right now. We're looking at the whole situation with family.
So they're exploring deporting them.
The possibility of deporting his family, despite their lack of involvement in the crime, is being actively explored. It's part of the broader crackdown strategy.
And this incident is also serving as justification for a major acceleration of immigration enforcement tactics nationwide. These new escalated operations, what do they look like in cities across the U.S.?
They look profoundly different than traditional enforcement. The strategy has shifted from passive enforcement like arresting someone at a scheduled hearing to these highly aggressive, very public street arrests.
So agents are actively hunting people down?
They're labeling them fugitives and tracking them down at their homes, their workplaces, even outside of schools where they're dropping off their children. It's designed to maximize visibility and intimidation.
And it's not just traditional immigration agencies like ICE running these operations.
That is a critical detail. We are seeing massive deployments involving agencies that normally focus on completely different areas.
Like who?
Border Patrol, FBI, and DEA agents. And they're being deployed in cities far from the border, places like Chicago and Charlotte.
And the problem is that many of these agents who might specialize in drug trafficking or organized crime, they don't have the specific nuanced training for civilian immigration law.
The training is minimal. We're talking about a 2-week immigration crash course. It's completely inadequate for the complexities of identifying legal status, understanding due process, or navigating community sensitivities.
And this minimal training, combined with the reliance on profiling, is leading to what sources are calling sloppy enforcement.
It is. It's sloppy and it's scattershot. And there are 2 major consequences to that.
What's the first one?
First, while they're making a high number of very public arrests, the actual long-term deportation success rate is often lower because the sloppy profiling means they frequently detain people who are later discovered to have legal status.
So they're arresting legal residents and even U.S. citizens.
Yes. People with valid visas, green cards, and in documented cases, U.S. citizens who get caught up in the dragnet because of their appearance or the language they speak. They're arrested, detained, and then eventually released, but the damage is done.
And the second consequence seems to align more with the strategic goal of the administration, which is driving people out.
Exactly. The tactics are highly public, aggressive, and very scary. We are seeing confrontations with protesters where agents are using pepper balls and tear gas in civilian neighborhoods.
And this show of force is designed to achieve what?
It's designed to drive undocumented immigrants to self-deport, to leave out of fear and exhaustion rather than waiting for lengthy legal proceedings that they might even win.
This intense pressure has to be creating this just pervasive atmosphere of fear across immigrant communities.
It creates widespread terror. That's the term used consistently in reports. The fear is palpable, it's pervasive, and it affects not just the undocumented, but documented immigrants who fear being mistakenly detained. Even U.S. citizens in mixed-status neighborhoods are scared.
And we have reports of communities organizing resistance strategies.
Yes, like handing out whistles.
Whistles.
Yes, in some communities, neighbors are handing out whistles to residents. The purpose is simple. When Border Patrol or federal agents are spotted in the neighborhood, residents blow the whistles to alert everyone instantly. It prompts people to hide inside or try to avoid the area. It reflects a level of fear and community tension not seen in decades.
This has been a necessary but very difficult walk through a tragedy and its immediate severe consequences. Let's just briefly review the core sequence of events that brought us to this policy inflection point.
We started with the tragic ambush in D.C. 2 members of the West Virginia National Guard specialist Sarah Beckstrom, who died, and Staff Sergeant Andrew Wolfe, who is critically injured, were targeted.
The suspect, Ramanullah Lakanwal, an Afghan national who drove across the country to commit an act the FBI is calling terrorism.
And the crucial complexity is Lakanwal's background. He was an Afghan ally, admitted under Operation Allies Welcome because of his prior service with a highly controversial CIA-backed counterterrorism unit.
The Zero Units, or Scorpion Forces, units notorious for allegations of severe human rights abuses.
And the central political irony: his asylum status was officially granted by the current administration in April 2025.
This tragic individual act then immediately served as the justification for a massive, aggressive policy crackdown.
An indefinite suspension of all immigration processing for Afghans, the president threatening to permanently pause migration from all third world countries, and critically, the launch of an unprecedented full-scale review of the green cards for legal permanent residents from 19 countries.
And finally, this policy rhetoric is being matched by an escalating, highly visible internal enforcement strategy, using minimally trained agents and public street arrests designed to drive mass fear and self-deportation.
It's a collision of a national security crisis and a rapid shift in ideological immigration policy, and it is defining this current moment.
It certainly is. And the layers of Lakanwal's profile, the CIA ties, the history of alleged abuses in his unit, his status as an ally, and the fact his asylum was granted so recently by the very administration now condemning the system, it makes this tragedy more than just a simple failure of vetting.
It raises an incredibly complicated question for the country, one that goes way beyond immediate security concerns.
And that question is,
Given the historical fact that the U.S. relied so heavily on paramilitary units like the Zero Units to fight its wars units that often engaged in highly controversial, high-trauma actions, how does the United States, moving forward, balance its moral obligation to protect these allies who served alongside American forces with the very legitimate and stated need to ensure domestic security and stability? The vetting system is clearly under attack, but the deeper tension lies in the legacy of relying on and then trying to absorb fighters from controversial U.S.-backed special forces. That tension between the promise we made and the precaution we must take is what will fundamentally challenge American policy and values in the coming years.